So we have here my Gargant that I painted recently. Really pleased with how this guy came out. He was actually done in a shade under 9 hours. I think that could have been 7 or less if I hadn't made the mistakes that I ended up learning from throughout the process. And I think I could have maybe at a push shaved an hour or 45 minutes off that if I was using an airbrush, but I didn't use an airbrush for any of this guy. So the way that I approached this was exactly how I approach getting armies to a high standard for tabletop as fast as possible. And I mean, this is a really good tabletop standard, this dude. An army like this would look phenomenal. Obviously there are some corners that have slightly been cut. The leather is probably the most obvious of them that kind of is noticeable from distance, but he is a super effective final job for the time considering. So the way that I approached him was to get a good layer of skin down. That was done with just 2 colors and dry brushing, and the only exception to that is that I gave the face some TLC. I just added white to exactly the same mixture of paints and kind of just, it's got really nice wrinkles on anyway, so I basically just filled them in and then blended them a tiny bit towards a central point. And I like to imagine light points within a lot of my painting, so I imagine light was coming at him from exactly the same direction the camera is at now, slightly from his left side, our right hand side whilst looking at it. That made the face look much higher quality than it actually is, because it stands out in comparison to the rest of it, and it also makes it look like he is being lit from the front. Like areas that are going to attract attention on this, obviously you've got the tattoos and a couple of like glowing light sources and stuff like that, but the skin is kind of the meat of it, and then you just want to pick a few solid details around the model that cover the rest. So for me that was, I've got 2 sources of glowing on him from his necklace, which was fairly successful, and from the orb, like, don't know what you'd say it was, probably something Skaven-y, which I think was much more successful. That kind of really stands out, and that's probably because it's such a different color from the rest of it. It's also easier to highlight up green to make it look brighter, because you can add yellow than it is with blue, because you're pushed towards just adding more white, which is less glowy. Get to use fluorescent paints with that as well, which is super successful. That was just done with a quick bit of dry brushing in those sections, just with white, and then I glazed the technical paint that came out, the Tesseract Glow. Just glazed a little bit of that with some moot green added. Really, really simple, very solid effect. And because the model is so simple in general, and his color scheme is so compact, like there's about 10 paints used pretty much, largely speaking, over the entirety of this model. I've used the same bone mixed with different things for the skin and the ropes and the fur and stuff like that. The same black has been highlighted with the same grey that was on the beard and stuff like that. So there's not too much variation going on all over, and the rust is done in some of the colours that are on the leather. When you do drop in something like a green, it really does make a really big difference and help things pop. So the other area that I spent a somewhat significant amount of time on considering was the, so we can get these to focus, the metallics. This has been done simply but with a few stages, fairly fast, and I brought variation in just by doing different amounts of different stages on either of them. So all of them are done with Vallejo Game Air Silver, and then Doomball Brown, Scrag Brown, Troll Slayer Orange, and Fire Dragon Bright, the standard kind of TM, GW by the numbers, brown through to orange warm spectrum. That's been done all over, and that's made a really big difference because they're obviously finished to quite a high degree for a tabletop standard mini, and they really, really do stand out. And he's got quite a lot of metal details on him. So between the skin being done to a high standard, there being a few eye-catching aspects like the tattoos, which I'll cover in a second, and then a couple of glowing bits and a good face and a solid weapon as well. Not like anything crazy mind-blowing. Some blood effects would have perhaps been a good idea on that, but you know, you've got to pick your battles when you're trying to get something done. There are going to be compromises when you're trying to get something done fast. Between those and making sure that the miniature had a good, solid overall level where nothing stands out as being, you know, like bad, that's basically the approach that I took to getting the model finished. The other stuff that I've done is important, which is tying him to his base by taking the base colours and working them up his feet. That's really important for setting him in the environment that he is based in. It just makes things look more kind of, I guess narrative is a way of putting it, but it's something I push with a lot of my painting, whether you are looking at a Space Marine. Here we go here, you can see what that does for him. This model would be pretty much nothing. He'd be solid without that base working its way up his feet, and with the base working its way up his feet, it provides warm, cool contrast, it ties him into his environment, you know, just does so much for it. And that approach, like I've basically gone through a list of things that I know are the bare minimum that I need to do, and I've made sure that none of them have been missed. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to do every single one of them to the best standards, but you have to do them to at least a basic standard. So things such as the horns are a really good example on this guy. Those horns were done like the bone on the rest of the model, which was done with basically a Rakarth flesh and AK ivory base coat. And then it's all been washed with a wash that involves snakebite leather contrast, a bit of seraphim sepia, and a couple of other things. Now that makes them look kind of a bit stained and yellow and not very kind of uniform. You can see those drip patches there, because I've not done it perfectly. And over that, I've just dry brushed white. Now, I've done it in a couple of stages. I've used a white that I'm really into. This is my new favorite white. I think it is absolutely incredible. But basically, I've just picked to do it to a high standard with one technique, probably for a little bit longer than you'd normally do dry brushing with one color for. But I've just done it really solidly with that one color, and then just it kind of in fitting with picking my battles. I've just stopped there. That's fine. It's absolutely solid. It looks pretty good. It's fairly effective. It does what it needs to. It kind of frames him nicely. Here we go. See that particularly, it just works well around his face. And that's it. Now, I could have highlighted them more. I could have put washes in the recesses, stuff like that. But you just have to pick which things matter. And so I got this guy to a certain point, and at the end of that certain point, which is having everything done fairly solidly, all I did was to add this glowy thing, that glowy thing, this tattoo, and that tattoo. And they do so much for this model. I've done the metallics to a solid area. That's where I was going to spend my my kind of time on something that was prevalent throughout the miniature, top to bottom. Basically, having done that, I picked a couple of key areas and did them as a finishing detail, and that along with the face really does tie things in. Just areas like you've got a little bit more on the metallics here, just this kind of whatever it is, pendant bell thing on his anklet. It really, really mounts up. And when you're considering the model as a whole, people's eyes are going to be pulled here because that color is nowhere else on the model, here because that color is nowhere else on the model, here because it's freehand and it's striking. I specifically chose to put that right there, front and center, not covered by his beard or anything else like this gem could be arguably. It is pretty much impossible to miss that freehand. It also went on an area where I'd done some pretty sloppy dry brushing. I just hadn't considered how kind of flat and level that was, and as a result I should have given it some kind of more care while I was working over it, and it just let me cover it. I covered it, I fixed a mistake and I added a detail at the same time, and that's always the type of thing I do. And equally with this one, this area here where it kind of blended into the mid calf, that was a bit sloppy, so I just covered it with something striking and black. Something I would like to touch on is this was the first one that I did. That's too dark. That looks like he's just kind of fresh out of LA Ink, getting his high level tats done, and that's not how I imagine a creature of destruction having their tattoo. So this one, and I think I should have probably pushed it a bit further, I took the same mix, which was a little bit of Huldra Blue and Vallejo's 950 Black, which are two of my favourite colours, and I just mixed some of my flesh highlight, which is Screaming Skull, just mix some of that into the mix for the tattoos. Now what that does is the blue kind of makes it look a little bit more inky instead of just like black. Black doesn't appear naturally like really anywhere if you think about it. So having it look like something that is ink colored as a base is a good start. And then to make that ink look more faded, and like I say, I probably should have added more of the bone to it, just adding it in and graying it, but graying it with something that is natural and already all over this model, and especially in the section that it's in, that really just pulls it back exactly into the spectrum that you're kind of looking for tattoos. So that's a real learning experience for me. This one is fine and it's striking, but even if you're like, oh cool, that's some like acceptable freehand, it does stand out a bit too much in perhaps not a way that I would like for the model. So that's why that I changed it for this one, and I'm much more happy with that. And indeed, I would add a higher proportion of blue and a higher proportion of the bone for that in the future for that reason. So that is my giant. If any of you have any questions about other aspects of this, I have got a painting tutorial up on the AO channel, but please feel absolutely free to ask me any questions about not just approaching this large model, but approaching large models in general. I put a lot of thought into my processes. I don't get as much time as I would like. This guy was done over numerous like 1 and a bit hour sessions. I would have much preferred to do him in 2 big blocks. I think that's a more enjoyable way to paint it, and you end up finishing things faster. But it did give me the opportunity to think about what I wanted to do in the next session over the course of probably like I guess 10 days. It's like 5 sessions on and off. The obvious area that I would go in and improve on this is the leather, and I just do that by repeating the base coats. So I had 3 browns that I used. I'd repeat them in the raised areas, and then I would maybe add again for kind of keeping things homogenized, add a bit of Screaming Skull and use that for the highlights. You could kind of dry brush them. I experimented with that a little bit in this section here on his kind of stomach, whatever it is. That would absolutely pull things up a notch. And then the other one that I would have open to me is areas where I've cut corners, like not washing these ropes, because I just wanted them to stand out for contrast, pardon me. I would wash again, any mix doesn't matter, kind of Devlin, muddy, sepia, black, it really wouldn't matter as long as you were careful, but you've got a load of points where you could have a really nice stark black lined detail here, and then go back in with bone mixed with white and recover these. That would make a really big difference on the stitches, and if you wanted to and kind of highlight each one of those things on the rope, it would take a couple of hours, but that would absolutely bring this guy up to the next level, and then he'd go from a kind of high tabletop standard to what I would arguably push as like a solid cabinet standard model, and absolutely a centerpiece for an army. So that's him. Pretty pleased with how he looks. I do think there are probably 2 hours that could have been saved in retrospect, having gone through the process once, just in terms of time saving things. I would have probably airbrushed all of his sections like this in the lightest of the browns, just to make it 1/3 faster for that, and then putting the other browns over a brown base coat. I could probably get away with doing 1 coat instead of 2 or something like that, and all these things really add up if you think about it when you're going over a model obsessively, which is how I think about pretty much everything to do with this hobby. So thank you very much for checking him out. Do let me know what you think, and if you've got any questions about my process, oh, I've had a casualty, oh dear. If you do have any questions about my process, how I would go about it, how you would go about something, or you've got a question of like, I don't know, I want my guy to look nurgly, what would you do with that? Do feel free to pop them below. I would be super stoked to answer your questions, help you out. And if you want to share a link to your giants that you've done or any tips on how you approach yours, then I'd love to read those as well. So thank you very much. Hope you like him, and I'll catch you in the next video or podcast.